It is my great honor to welcome you to this virtual seminar on social infrastructure, financing and use of digital technologies. I will serve as the Master of Ceremonies for today's seminar. The Ministry of Finance of India and the New Development Bank are co-hosting this virtual seminar, which is being held in connection with BRICS 2021 Economic and Financial Cooperation Agenda. The seminar will explore key considerations around the landscape of social infrastructure financing with a focus on BRICS countries. We hope that this could also serve as an opportunity for the New Development Bank to bolster its role in financing social infrastructure through interaction with the relevant stakeholders. The seminar will focus on 3 sessions: the inaugural session, including a keynote address, followed by a high-level panel discussion, and then thematic sessions on integrating digital technology and social infrastructure for current times, and then mobilizing financing for social infrastructure in the BRICS countries. We are very pleased that Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Finance of India, the President of the New Development Bank, and academic luminary Professor Jeffrey Sachs will participate in the inaugural session. The high-level panel includes participants from the government, national and multilateral development institutions, as well as academia. The thematic sessions on social infrastructure will have presentations by representatives from the McKinsey Global Institute and the Boston Consulting Group. We are encouraged by the broad attendance from different government agencies across the BRICS countries, multilateral and national development institutions, academia, as well as the private sector. Given the virtual format, we kindly request all speakers to mute their microphones unless they are invited to speak. We also invite the attendees to submit questions to the high-level panel and the thematic presenters using the Q&A function on the Zoom. The moderator will then select a few questions for each of those sessions, and the speakers will then react. We will now commence with the inaugural session and the keynote speech. It is my privilege to firstly hand the floor to Mr. Ajay Seth, the Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs from the Ministry of Finance of India, who is also the alternate governor for India on the Board of Governors of the New Development Bank. Mr. Seth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. President of New Development Bank, Mr. Marcos, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, distinguished speakers in today's seminar, senior management and staff of New Development Bank, and other participants. I am thankful to the bank for taking this lead to co-host this event today on a topic which is very germane, that how do we move from the current position of pandemic crisis to a post-pandemic, a better world and a more resilient world and with more inclusive development. Of course, this pandemic has caused a setback to our journey towards sustainable development goals, and I'm sure that with participation of all stakeholders, we can resume that journey and we can continue our journey in that direction. We're all aware, and we are fortunate to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs with us today, whose thought leadership in sustainable development and whose advocacy and thoughts have helped various governments and development agencies to formulate their policies and their programs for a better world. Today's theme of financing of social infrastructure and use of digital technology conveys a very firm resolve of finance ministers of BRICS countries and the central bank governors. This particular topic, covering social infrastructure, in particular health and education, for which Sustainable Goals 3 and 4 pertain to, are the foundation for sustainable development. But it is not just about financing. So the topic suggests that it is financing of social infrastructure. These two sectors, apart from the financing, the mode of delivery is equally important. So today's seminar, I'm sure that the 5 sub-themes which have been given, the keynote speakers and others would be deliberating upon it, and we will have a collective thought process that with help of the bank and the BRICS countries where we should be moving. Education and health being quasi-public goods with elements of public goods at some extreme and with private goods at some other level of services. Both these aspects of financing and mode of delivery are important. But it's not necessary that the mode of delivery should be in public domain itself. For example, in education, obviously the goal is that all children in school and having and learning well. But as SDG 4 also envisages, it's not just about the basic level of education. Our ambition now moves to the next level of skills. Skills so that all citizens in the working age can participate in the economic activities and have productive vocations. Similarly, in health, public health and basic health care to be available for all. But then comes the curative health care. Now, and there, the financing in the mode of delivery becomes even more complex. Both these sectors also suffer from, or rather is inherent to them, it is not suffering, but it is inherent to them, a trilemma. Trilemma of limited resources, access and quality. And at best, one can control only 2 or deliver on 2. Resources are always limited. So the question then arises with whether the focus is on access or focus is on quality. Among the BRICS countries, the tax effort for India is perhaps the lowest. Other countries are 20% and above of the GDP they collect. So the money which can be brought in from the fiscal being limited, one has to look at that what can be innovative ways, getting in the private capital for financing as well as for delivery, where a lot more can happen. Similarly, there is a wide variation in life expectancy and the public expenditure which happens on health as well as on education. Now, in education, all 3 countries spend about 4.5% of the GDP. 2 countries, namely Brazil and South Africa, spend about 6% plus of the GDP on education. Health, again, India's public expenditure is the least among the BRIC countries. So here again, a more nuanced approach to financing as well as the best way of delivery will have to be thought through. But technology can help in easing up that dilemma, and it can help in getting in the delivery mode. Let's give an example that when we talk about education sector, what the technology can do, it is not about like in a present day situation where schooling is not possible because of the social distancing requirement. There have been 0 year where the schools could not open throughout the year. And the people who could afford distance education through digital means, again, there is a class divide. The poor could not have access to that mode of learning. But as far as school education is concerned, technology cannot replace the teacher. Technology can help the teacher to have access to better control, better content. It can help the teacher in the classroom to present his ideas using technology in a better manner. But when it comes to the higher level of education, to the skill imparted, the skill sets, the skill education, then technology can play a very, very strong role. Similarly, in the case of health, telemedicine, diagnostic interpretation is a big area wherein the access problem can be mitigated to a large extent by using technology. But how do we build technology so that it does not create further inequality into the system, but it does where the poor have the access first. So we have to look at that technology helps the people at the bottom of the pyramid first before the people who are at the top of the pyramid who can then fend for themselves with technology or without technology itself. Health brings it another element of complexity when it comes to the curative, because we have seen that the insurance-led model has thrown up its own challenges, and there are wide experiences from one country to another. At the same time, they have been, I won't call it as a pilot level, but at a scale model, but not covering the bad country models, which is a public trust model, wherein the pooling of contributions and recurring contributions are pulled in, and then the public trust model then delivers or finances most of the expenses which happen. So these are some of the challenges, and some of these challenges certainly we face in India, and we hope that this seminar will help in putting together, learning from each other's experience, and then the bank taking a lead as it embarks upon having its general strategy for the period 2022 to 2026, imbibe into its development plan and help the BRIC countries to move towards a more sustainable path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seth, for your remarks and for sharing your invaluable experiences of India on social infrastructure and the nuances and approach which you've shared with us. We really appreciate those remarks. I am now pleased to invite Mr. Marcos Troyo, the President of the New Development Bank, to address us. Mr. Troyo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I want to start by thanking the government of India, India's Ministry of Finance, Secretary Ajay Seth, and his team for helping put this together. Congratulations, sir, on your opening remarks. I also want to say thank you to Vice President Anil Kishore of the New Development Bank and his team, who worked very hard in making this happen. I want to say hi to the eminent Professor Jeffrey Sachs, one of the world's leading voices and leading minds in the field of development, and also express our gratitude to the thought leaders in academia, in government, in development agencies, in the private sector, who share their knowledge with us today. We have about 30 representatives of 30 different countries joining us from the four corners of the globe. So this is indeed, I think, a very important situation. Well, dear friends, this seminar takes place at a critical time in the life of our nations. COVID is a global threat. The virus is a tough enemy. Fighting our worst nightmares calls for more social infrastructure investment. Living our sweetest development dreams also calls for more social infrastructure investment. Social infrastructure, in a sense, has become more important than ever. And the pandemic has also moved digital technologies to center stage. We can no longer think of schools deprived of connectivity or hospitals that lack early warning systems. Digital tools expand and speed up the delivery of social infrastructure solutions. Therefore, the seminar will go beyond financing. It will look into the indispensable links between the social and the digital spheres. Well, my friends, the BRICS, our countries, are home to more than 40% of the world's population. We are big consumers of social infrastructure. But our seminar today also examines how BRICS can lead the way and increasingly become major producers of social infrastructure solutions at a global level. Social infrastructure and sustainable development go hand in hand. They cannot be disconnected. Without the provision of affordable and good quality social infrastructure, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will simply go unmet, especially when it comes to ensuring access to healthcare and education. Multilateral development institutions, such as ours, have an essential role to play in supporting social infrastructure, and such a role goes beyond financial resources. We must be there convening stakeholders, mainstreaming good practices, fostering conducive ecosystems, and of course, leading the conversation on social infrastructure, as we are doing today. Our new development bank aspires to become the premier development agency for social infrastructure, not only in the BRICS, but across emerging countries. We were founded recently, a little less than 6 years ago, but a lot has already been directed to improving human capital. Up until now, the NDB has provided over $1 billion to financing social infrastructure projects. And this is on top of the $9 billion in emergency assistance to fight COVID and promote economic recovery across our member countries. Dear friends, as the NDB, the New Development Bank, moves into the next cycle of 5 years, social infrastructure is ingrained as part of our DNA, as part of our strategic area. 3 words, 3 concepts can capture NDB's approach to social infrastructure. The NDB sets out to be catalytic, innovative, and impactful. Now, why catalytic? Because we must crowd in financing for social infrastructure solutions. This involves the right kind of instruments that enhance private sector participation. The NDB is open to supporting projects with a demonstration effect as well, which can be multiplied in the BRICS and beyond. Now, why innovative? Because sometimes innovation is not necessarily represented by the latest cutting-edge technology. Innovation is also the outcome of how you bring together the physical, financial, and technological elements of the equation. And by doing so, the NDB will enhance the design and dissemination of knowledge and innovative practices. And now, why impactful? Because our bank will have a client-centered mentality that helps member countries achieve their goals under the 2030 agenda. My friends, going forward, the NDB will work together with India's government, the Ministry of Finance, and our development partners to engage in a series of similar seminars to this one we're holding today. So please see today's seminar not as a one-off, but as the first of many in the cooperation between India's BRICS presidency and the New Development Bank on the key topics of our common agenda. I wish us all a very productive seminar, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, President Troyo, for your inspiring speech. We note that innovating social infrastructure will now be one of NDB's main priorities in the coming 5-year cycle of operations. We are encouraged that under your leadership, NDB will play a more pivotal role, not only in our member countries, but also in other emerging countries to strengthen social infrastructure. I am now pleased to invite Professor Jeffrey Sachs, a world-renowned economics professor and global thought leader who needs no introduction. He currently serves as the Director for the Center of Sustainable Development at Columbia University and is also the President of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a Commissioner for the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. We are honored that Professor Sachs has taken the time out of his busy schedule to provide the keynote address for today. I now hand the floor to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I am deeply honored and very grateful for this invitation to join the NDB and the discussion today on social infrastructure. This is an extraordinarily important time and promising time for development banking. And so I look forward to the NDB going from triumph to triumph and expanding operations tremendously in the coming years. So I really hope you can see the bank as a pivotal instrument, as President Troyo just said, not only for the BRICS countries, but for developing countries generally. This is an era where investment is both extraordinarily high return and extremely important for the developing countries to close gaps with the richer countries and to gain tremendously in technological capacity. COVID has really not only been a profound tragedy and disruptor, it has also shown how decisively the technology gaps play in the world. Countries that are manufacturing vaccines are coming out of this crisis. The rest of the world is waiting right now. And we need technological capacity everywhere. We can't have a world that is divided between the haves and the have-nots. Even with the gaps widening as technology soars, we need to make sure that the developing regions are leapfrogging, closing gaps. And that is feasible today because digital technologies are a leapfrog technology. They enable capacities to develop very rapidly, but they require upfront investments. So I am a big advocate. Go into debt, borrow in order to finance the real infrastructure that you need right now. Do not wait. This is the time for major investment scale up. This is the way that China achieved the most remarkable sustained growth over 4 decades through upfront, large scale, critical investments. And I think that this is what development finance is all about in the coming years. There are 3 keys to that investment, in my view. So I'll add my 3 highlights. The first is digital as the most important cluster of technologies for addressing needs across the economy. There isn't a single sector, productive, social, or otherwise, that isn't profoundly enabled by digital connectivity, artificial intelligence, smart systems, Internet of Things. And so having a solid platform of 5G connectivity is extraordinarily important, and making sure that access is universal so that societies are not divided between those who are online and those who can't participate, which of course has happened during the COVID pandemic. The second key word is green. We must develop in a way that is environmentally sustainable. The whole planet is at threat right now of multiple environmental unsustainabilities, not only climate change, but collapse of biodiversity, massive pollution, and zoonotic disease. So green recovery means a focus on renewable energy as absolutely critical, and it means sustainable land use practices, high value precision agriculture to reduce the tremendous strains that agriculture puts on the biosphere. And the third pillar of this investment, maybe the most, I would say surely the most important, but dependent on the first 2, is human capital, especially education. If there is one fundamental driver of human betterment, it is knowledge. And that is the quality of education at the very center of development. It is unthinkable at any time, but especially in the 21st century, to have development that is based on, say, natural resources or physical capital, because our economic life and our social life and our well-being depends, especially in the 21st century, on well-educated young people. And we know that there are very, very significant gaps in the quality of education at all levels in the developing countries, and in general, a profound need to expand access, first to complete universal upper secondary education, and to have a massive increase of higher education. To my mind, these 3 pillars, the digital, the green, and the commitment to education, all work in synergy. because I believe that the digital access will enable all societies to advance tremendously in education access. I can tell you, even before COVID, for the last 10 years, I've been teaching heavily online in blended learning with the chance to have classes across the world simultaneously. I believe in students at Columbia University being together with students in Shanghai, Beijing, Sao Paulo, Moscow. Why not connect our students together for joint learning? We've been having seminars pre-COVID all over the world. And from what I can see, in fact, what we are implementing, and this is a point I think for the bank to help champion also, online higher education can enable a massive scale up in the proportion of young people who are able to develop advanced professional skills at a tiny fraction of the cost that is involved in an on-campus full brick and mortar education. In Africa, in particular, the proportion of young people who go on to higher education now is exceedingly small and dangerously small. But with digital access, we could have low cost higher education at a high quality available for young people all over the continent at a very low cost, and with the little bit of ingenuity and innovation with blended learning at the campuses as well for 1 or 2 days a month. And that would enable a tremendous leapfrogging of educational capabilities. Well, as Secretary Seth said and President Troyo said, the possibilities with digital technologies, if there is access, are really almost unimaginable now how powerful. We're seeing this in education at all levels, as I've mentioned. I'm watching my young granddaughters online doing, having a highly fruitful educational experience. We're seeing it at higher education levels, and we're seeing it in another crucial social sector in healthcare. Because another task I think that the NDB can help to bring about is universal access to healthcare services through digital access, which of course, as Secretary Seth said, enables radiologists in India to be reading x-rays halfway around the world, enables remote monitoring of symptoms, remote diagnostics, emergency support services. So let me conclude by saying that I believe we're entering an era of massive scale up of investment with a very heavy emphasis on public investment to ensure universality of access. And especially in the poorer countries, we need to not delay any longer electrification, which can be brought everywhere with mini grids, microgrids, or large scale solar, wind, hydro, and other clean energy options. We should not delay universal access to high quality 5G services. I am a big fan of Huawei. I am a big fan of other quality producers. I resent the United States trying to divide up the world or to castigate companies as unworthy of this. You know better, go for it, invest heavily in 5G and get these systems built, and then innovate. And I think the bank can play a huge innovative role in showing how, with the physical access, with the power generation of green and renewable energy, and with the software writing to meet local needs and the platforms to meet local needs, the expansion of education of healthcare and of other social services can leapfrog so that these divides that exist in the world can be rapidly closed in the coming years. That's what the NDB is all about. And I wish you all success and all boldness in your objectives. Please scale up. This is the era to do it. Thank you very much.
Very much, Professor Sachs, for those insightful remarks, especially on how critical a moment it is to focus on investment in digital economy and underscoring the importance of access thereto. Your insights on green recovery and human capital are of particular importance for an MDB such as the New Development Bank. And this focus is indeed consistent with our mandate. So thank you very much for those inspiring words today. We now move to the high-level panel of today's seminar. Ms. Lerato Mbele, who is from the BBC World News Business Report, will moderate this session. Before handing the floor to Ms. Mbele, I kindly request all panelists to turn on their cameras and unmute themselves when they take the floor. Ms. Mbele, the floor is yours.
Yolanda, thank you so much for your time and your input. Let me start off by saying, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, it gives me great pleasure to be moderating this high-level panel where our topic is mobilizing capital for more investments in social infrastructure and the use of digital technology. It's a timely discussion to have, not least for the reasons that have been presented to us, both by the President of the New Development Bank and Professor Jeffrey Sachs himself. The world has been ravaged by COVID-19, and what the pandemic has done the world over is demonstrated the vulnerability of healthcare systems by way of their capacities and also the pressing need for children to stay in school. So as we have this conversation today, let us remember the reality of the world we live in and have that as the context for reference. As Yolanda has said, my name is Lerato Mbele. I am the outgoing presenter of African Business and Economic News at BBC World Television. And in my time, traveling extensively across the African continent and in other emerging markets, what I've seen is ingenuity, creativity, as people find solutions, even if there are gaps on the part of policymakers and in the use of public financing. Now, having said that, let me remind you of something that we all know, and actually things we have been urged to think about this afternoon. Enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals, in the values of humanism, is the fact that every child has a right to a decent education. Every woman must be able to access good quality primary health care. Every family deserves the security of knowing that they have a roof over their head and basic amenities from water to electricity. And every man or every woman has and deserves the dignity of being able to earn their own income with a secure and stable job. And that can only be accomplished in economies that are growing. However, as we draw closer and closer to the 2030 deadline for the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, they are becoming elusive, as Professor Sachs referred to earlier on. Fewer children in Africa, for instance, registering to go to university. And why is that? I would argue that it's because within some of these emerging markets, there isn't adequate investment in social infrastructure. And that's also because the business community perhaps doesn't regard social infrastructure as an asset class. They see it rather as a public good, something that governments must provide. However, I'm hoping that in the conversation we have this afternoon, we change that approach and we demonstrate that there is value, return on investment, and social impact in investing in social infrastructure, in investing in building schools, clinics, and hospitals. From our illustrious panel, we're going to get examples of what is happening on the ground in some of these BRICS economies, in Brazil, in Russia, and in India, We're going to get a sense of what development finance institutions are doing to support the rollout of capital. And perhaps in the conversation, we're going to hear about creative financial models, collaboration between government, business, multilateral development organizations, all with the common purpose of ensuring that everybody has equal access to the most basic of services and that we can catalyze growth through the investments of better quality education and proper facilitation of healthcare. Our panelists are made up of 4 accomplished speakers, namely Mr. Baldeo Purushottam from the Ministry of Finance in India. He's going to be giving us a perspective from India, particularly speaking to us about the importance of understanding economic infrastructure and also social infrastructure, and not really distinguishing between the two, but incorporating the perspectives on the two. We also have Professor Ronaldo Lemos from the Schwarzman College at Cinchua, Columbia University, giving us a perspective from the Brazilian experience. We're going to hear from Mr. Xiang Su, who's the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the New Development Bank, talking to us about what the New Development Bank and other multilateral development bodies can do in fast-tracking this rollout of capital. And last but not least, we're also going to hear from Maxim Merkulov, who is going to be giving us a perspective from the Russian Federation. Without further ado, may I hand over to you, Mr. Purushottam, representing the Ministry of Finance in India, as you speak to us about the concepts of social infrastructure.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mbele, for setting up the context and for the kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I will have a brief presentation on infrastructure financing, use of digital technology, its challenges, and India's experience and policy responses to meeting out these challenges. Is it visible now, my presentation?
It is indeed, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So generally, we divide infrastructure into groups: economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. And although there is not a watertight definition of these two group of infrastructure, categories of infrastructure, but there have been some attempts. Like economic infrastructure is something which promotes economic activity, whereas social infrastructure is something which facilitates social services, supports human development, quality of life, and living standards. But we can even see that because they are not mutually exclusive, rather than attempting for a definition, it's better to have some indicative list of sectors and subsectors characterizing economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. So we can have public utilities, power, telecom, public works, road, dams, canal, railways, and public transport systems, railways, urban transport, ports, waterways, etc., as part of economic infrastructure, whereas health, education, housing, social and judicial facilities, civic municipal structures are part of social infrastructure. Now, we have seen over the years that there is an investment deficit in social infrastructure. And although public investment in social infrastructure has increased over 2005 to 2019 by a minuscule percentage, but private sector investment fell from $19 billion to $3 billion during this period. And if we couple it with the increasing burden due to COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only shown the acute shortfall in healthcare facilities in all countries, but it also shown to us that a country cannot develop and face challenges only on focusing on economic infrastructure and if not promoting social infrastructure also. But the silver line is that countries across the world are showing their intent to increase investment in social infrastructure. And therefore, resilient social infrastructure is very much important in post-COVID-19 economic scenario. Now, when we are saying financing or investing in social infrastructure, it's not only government financing or investment, but rather it's also include private participation in a big way. Because private participation is not only bridging the financing gap, but it also brings a lot of value for money by optimizing construction and operational cost, by deploying innovative technologies at low cost, by improving service delivery and optimizing turnaround time. And probably this aspect of private participation is far more important than only bridging the financing gap. Now, in this respect, the role of MDBs in social infrastructure is very, very important. We all know that MDBs plays multiple role in infrastructure. They are directly financing projects. They are also mobilizing private capital. They are also helping in building bankable infrastructure pipeline, and they also help in de-risking private investment. So therefore, after COVID pandemic and in the recovery period, we have seen that MDB after MDB have increased their focus on social infrastructure financing and promotion. And in this overall activity, NDB is also taking a lead by sharpening its focus in social infrastructure. We all know that during 17 to 21 general strategy, there was an emphasis on social infrastructure. But the upcoming general strategy 2026, social infrastructure is set to occupy a prominent space as one of the NDB's main operational priority. And that is very, very heartening and welcoming as far as NDB's support to social infrastructure is concerned. So what are the challenges social infrastructure is facing in terms of financing? I know there are multiple challenges. It's very difficult to summarize everything into one slide, but even after taking the risk of oversimplification, I can say that generally economic infrastructure is paid by user fee, whereas social infrastructure is generally paid fully or partially by government. Economic infrastructure focus on cost recovery, whereas social infrastructure focus more on social benefits. For economic infrastructure, risk return framework is well established across countries, whereas social infrastructure, PPP is in nascent stage, and PPP in social infrastructure is still perceived a high risk investment. And economic infrastructure investors are generally interested in a medium to short to medium term investment ranging from 15 to 30 years, whereas social infrastructure investment is for a far longer time. Educational institutions, healthcare institutions are running hundreds of years rather than only thinking in terms of 20 to 30 years. And generally, economic infrastructures are large scale projects with higher returns. Social infrastructure projects are considered as small value projects with low returns. Now, if we see the social infrastructure financing scenario in India, from 2009 to 2019, there's a steady growth of GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, but somehow the spending on healthcare and education has remained stagnant. And that is one of the big handicaps we are facing, and we are working on it, how to meet out these challenges. However, in spite of this issue, during 2005 to 19, tremendous development has happened in social sectors of health and education. For example, hospital beds per 1,000 people has increased by 40%. Literacy rate has grew by 18% during this period. Although in the education sector, in the health sector, the expenditure remain stagnant as percentage of GDP. But in education sector, it has increased by 35% of what was in 2005 and what was in 2019. So if we compare it with high income countries who have spent 14 to 20% of their GDP on healthcare and education, there is still a lot of expenditure to be done in India as part of GDP in social sector, especially health and education. But India is one of the leading countries which is having the most robust framework, policy supports and measures for enabling PPP environment, not only for social infrastructure, but for infrastructure also. And for social infrastructure, we are having very robust policy framework like National Health Policy, which encourage investment, financial as well non-financial incentives for encouraging PPP, etc. We have foreign direct investment policy, which allows 100% FDI through automated route in hospital and educational institution, housing, etc. And we have national education policy, which sets investment in educational infrastructure along with making digital infrastructure a priority. So these are some of the policy framework to give a very robust support to financing of infrastructure by government as well as by private sector. Now we have very strong institutional pillars also, and two of the institutional pillars are housed in the Department of Economic Affairs, in which I am working. A PPP cell, which is a kind of nodal cell looking after policy matters of PPP, and also there is a PPP appraisal committee at very high level, which approves and appraises central PPP projects beyond a particular size. And then we have financial support mechanism also, like tax incentives for hospitals with certain conditions. And we have a very innovative viability gap funding scheme, which we have also changed in response to COVID pandemic challenges. And under this scheme, the government is providing up to 60 to 80% of capital expenditure and up to 50% of operational expenditure for first 5 years to PPP projects in social infrastructure. And we have also very well-defined set of documents, guidelines, toolkits, manuals, etc., to help support and promote PPP in infrastructure as well as social infrastructure. Now, there are multiple schemes and initiatives by Government of India and state governments. I would take few just to introduce here. For example, there is a Ayushman Bharat scheme, which gives free healthcare access to 500 million people through National Insurance Scheme. Under Self-Reliant India, there is a commitment of government to spend almost $200 billion towards infrastructure development by 2024. Then central government is providing financial assistance to subnational governments, states, for expanding and improving public health expenditure under National Health Mission. There are performance-linked initiative. Also, this has come as a response to the various challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic, where we are encouraging participants in medical device parks, pharmaceutical parks, or whole sort of other kind of sectors and subsectors of infrastructure with performance-linked incentives. And then there are tax credits also for hospitals, setting up hospitals and upgrading it. In education sector also, we have certain schemes and initiatives like Higher Education Financing Agency to fund educational projects through extra budgetary resources. There is a Prime Minister Innovative Learning Program to identify and encourage talented children to enrich their skills and knowledge. And there is also a PPP initiatives to establish new technological centers and extension centers everywhere in the country, which inter alia also work on providing skilling to the needful people. In water and sanitation, there is a water mission which aims for providing drinking water to all rural households by 2024. There is an Amrit scheme which aims to improve water, sewerage, and transport facilities in 500 cities across country. And there is a very important, I will come to this Namami Gange program later on. Now, there could be n number of models to enhance PSP participation in social infrastructure and promoting PPP in social infrastructure. And I have just given a snapshot of that, how different models could be for, say, service contract, management contract, lease, concession, BOT, DB, float, etc. But these are not something which are casted in stone. These are very flexible, and countries can change it, amend it as per their specific requirements. Some of the indicative list of projects which I have given here, how we are using, for example, one of the example of management contract is that we have a Rajiv Gandhi super specialty hospital in tertiary care health sector, where there is a PPP between government of Karnataka and a private player to not only manage that hospital, but also to provide free outpatient services to below poverty line patients. Then there is a PPP between Health Ministry, Government of India and private players for labs, drug supply and diagnostic services to deliver high-end diagnostic services at government cap rate. So the rate is fixed by government and the PPP partner is providing these services at government cap rate for partner hospitals. Then in a BOT model, we have India Institute of Information Technology set up, which is a PPP between central government, state government and industry partner to set up these triple IT in a non-profit PPP model and run by private industry partners. Similarly, in India, we are also exploring all sorts of financial mechanism to support PPP in social infrastructure. There is a budgetary support by national and sub-national government. Then there are government grants like VGF grants to assist government agencies with set conditions. And then there is priority sector bank lending for infrastructure sector, including social infrastructure. And then there are funding from multilateral and bilateral agencies. Those are also being explored. There are tax exemptions and related incentives by national and sub-national government. And also private players are funding infrastructure projects through equity, lending from financial institution, also getting money through capital market instruments and bond market, etc. So I will take this Namami Gange mission just as a showcase project, and also how this project is meeting out the challenges being faced by social infrastructure sector. So we all know that Holy Ganges is the most holy river in India, and every Indian, millions and billions of Indians want this river to be a clean and free-flowing river. So the objective of Namami Gange mission is to reduce pollution flowing into river Ganges by private sector expertise leveraged to construct, operate and maintenance STPs through PPP mode. Now, the challenges, as we discussed earlier, one of the challenges was low project value concern. So in this scheme, we meet out this by clustering various cities in one group to make the overall package a bigger package. For example, 11 major cities have been packaged as one package, one city, one operator scheme. Now, other was cost recovery, because cost is not being recovered in a short to medium term. Here, the cost recovery is ensured by hybrid annuity model, where 40% of the capital cost is paid by government to concessionaire on construction, and rest 60% is going back to concessionaire on performance linked annuity. Now, social infrastructure projects are long-term projects to ensure that it is it's favorable by investors and investors are comfortable. The concession period is kept only 17 years so that they can get back their investment in a relatively shorter time. And to de-risk this project, a very clear tripartite agreement clearly defining risk and responsibility of each of the party is signed between the partners. National Mission to Clean Ganga, state water authorities and private sector developers. And the outcome which has achieved 11 cities under one city, one operator scheme. This is first successful hybrid annuity model in sewage treatment plant in India. A lot of public benefit is coming in terms of improved drinking and industrial water supply, reduced asset stress on groundwater, and better water for irrigation, etc. And this has also a potential for replication. Some of the initiatives, digital initiatives which India has taken in response to COVID pandemic, and I am taking because all regular digital initiative in terms of healthcare or education, by bringing this access to the people through digital channels is also being done in Indian scenario. But these are some of the initiatives which have been taken only in response to COVID pandemic, like Arogya Setu for contact tracing, syndrome mapping and self-assessment. Then India is also doing one of the largest vaccine management program in the world and that has been done with support of CoWIN application, where a beneficiary is getting himself enrolled, and through this app, he is getting where to come, at what date and time to come for vaccination. So this is a very smooth functioning system. Then COVID India portal for reporting of cases and consolidating all the supply side, logistics side, and analysis part. Then there's a RT-PCR app for staff, how to collect sample, how, and all the know-how about that. And then there are various innovative solutions based on artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., like mobile robots for carrying drugs, food and medical waste disposal in COVID-19 wards in hospitals, because many times, there's always a danger of contamination. So these robotic robots have done a wonderful job. Now, the last thing is that during India's BRICS presidency 2021, for the PPP task force, there has been a well-identified area of social infrastructure, financing, and use of digital technology, because this is need of the hour. We all understand that how COVID pandemic has shown it to us, and how we all are supposed to work on this to meet out the challenges. And therefore, BRICS finance ministers also agreed to focus on social infrastructure, financing, and use of digital technologies under India's 2021 presidency, with aim to develop a technical report to collaborate and share knowledge on financing and use of digital technologies in enhancing quality of social infrastructure services. And I'm hopeful that with the help and support of all the BRICS member countries and NDB, we would come up with a quality report on social infrastructure, financing, and use of digital technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for a really comprehensive presentation and speaking us through some of the more creative ways of approaching financing. We really appreciate your contribution. I'd like to hand the virtual floor over now to Mr. Maxim Merkulov from VEB, the Russian Federation, and he's going to speak to us about a range of issues, but particularly how to foster greater collaboration, cooperation between business, government, and multilateral development banks, all important PPEs. Maxim is the head of the Directorate for the Implementation of International Infrastructure Practices and PPP Development. Maxim Merkulov, over to you. Please remember to share your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Let me express gratitude to the New Development Bank and the Ministry of Finance of India for the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. I believe that the social infrastructure is often unfairly and wrongly lack of focus and attention on international forums and discussion forums. And thank you for putting it in the center of the agenda at such a proper time. So I'll start with a quick snapshot of PPP market in Russia and a few words about the social infrastructure particularly. Social infrastructure projects represent a considerable segment of the PPP market, and which is growing steadily and consists of several equally important subsectors such as healthcare, education, tourism, social care, and sports. And recently, new types of social infrastructure facilities have been allowed to be provided via PPP, namely assisted living homes for elder people and detoxification centers. But in 2020, social infrastructure PPP projects were hit rather hard by the COVID-19. I mean, the projects that were structured not via fully contracted income. That happened due to the imposed restriction on public mobility, and the user demand reached a historical minimum. And now as the restrictions are lifted, projects' financial sustainability is at recovery stage, but anyway, private investors are still cautious about launching new projects and ask for additional risk mitigation mechanisms in the projects. Regarding digital interventions, private investors show an increasing interest in exploring the potential of digital innovations, especially in healthcare and education. And most cases so far refer to the provision of telemedicine services and online education. As for innovating financing tools in Russia, unified and standardized financial products and services are gaining significant popularity in the PPP market, including some of them are out-of-the-box solutions. And further, I'd like to highlight several relevant cases from Russia regarding this implementation of social infrastructure projects. One of the example, and I'll show you next slide. So the first project is how digital technologies can improve social infrastructure services. This project was launched in 2019 in Novgorod the Great, a city of Russia. It's a prominent tourist destination, and the project was associated with the construction, operation, and maintenance of IT infrastructure to manage big data generated by tourism and leisure infrastructure. Its main goal is to collect tourist metrics by tracking tourist movement, behavior, and use of infrastructure. And based on that, several aggregated tourist profiles can be compiled to assist in policy decision-making. Another possible application is managing a load of infrastructure to minimize tourist exposure to COVID-19. As you can see, the estimated project cost is only $43,000, which is a relatively small figure, meaning that such projects can be easily replicated in various tourist areas. As it has been noted before, the data collection, storage, and subsequent analysis of such data can be done at minimum cost via modern digital solutions. And the next case is a standardized state financing program for development public school infrastructure. And we develop it through PPP mechanisms. And it's a quite recent case. The program had been launched in February 2021. And it was launched by the Ministry of Education of Russia and State Corporation of VEB. And the main aim is to mobilize private financing of school infrastructure and make up for a shortfall of school places. And the program's financial support will include the provision of capital subsidies and co-funding of availability payments. For these purposes, the government has allocated about $8 billion by 2024. And the volume of support will be determined based on the regional fiscal position and sustainability. At the moment, projects are being selected on a competitive basis, and the first projects are to receive financing in June. Selected projects will follow explicitly specified standard contract provisions, and then afterwards it will undergo contract performance monitoring with participation of VEB. The next case is about Moscow energy efficient schools, and it's another replicable example how that the social projects could be implemented in an efficient way and then could be replicated in other regions. Moscow city government set as one of its priority topics is providing the highest level of school education for children, including their provision of equipment and a comfortable, inclusive environment. That doesn't, however, preclude from finding the most efficient means to introduce energy efficient approaches in building, operation, and maintenance. Currently, Moscow authorities launched a pilot program to develop, test, and implement the smart school standard. The completion of the pilot stage presently running in 5 schools is due in 2022. So what is the smart school? It's based on 4 main pillars: smart lighting, smart energy, smart heat, and smart system. These 4 pillars are based on various sensors and programmable controllers that are intertwined through the software and the cutting-edge integrated automatic system. So what are the benefits of these projects? The first one is illumination. It turns only where it's required, their motion sensors, and automatically accommodates to outdoor light. Second, same the temperature with the temperature controlling. Third one is the online status of all subsystems and prompt troubleshooting that gives sufficient prolongation of system components and service life. And definitely efficient consumption of energy. Preliminary calculations demonstrate that the overall reduction of energy consumption would be up to 70% from the current baseline. Anyway, one of the obstacles identified so far is that the current procurement procedures and requirements in Russia, we need to have a tender for each component. And this fact hampers the process to get a complex one-size-fits-all solution. So we hope that this pilot project will be successful and will see results then less than in a year. The next slide is about some kind of sort of comprehensive approach. And speaking from the perspective of a state development corporation, we find it equally important to emphasize the social aspects of all infrastructure projects and that comprehensively support quality and sustainable infrastructure. To accomplish that, in 2020, we developed a national system for assessment and certification of infrastructure projects called IRIS. And it allows assessing crucial aspects of projects' quality, such as economy and governance, quality of life, environment and climate, and it fully corresponds to internationally claimed standards and best practices, as well as quality infrastructure investment principles that has been endorsed by G20. IRIS incorporates requirements of international investors, development institutions, and financing organizations. Our system was supported by many international organizations, such as the World Bank, OECD, and other international experts. And the system is being piloted in the moment and it will be fully launched by 2022. We strive to make it as a working, practical tool for increasing quality and sustainability of infrastructure, both social and economic infrastructure. Concluding, I'd like now to recap that we do believe in effective PPP models for social infrastructure. However, we should be assured about the contribution of private partner in innovative ways to the funding, construction, upgrading, and operation of facilities. And that gives additional value for money for the project. And besides that, I'm pretty sure that MDBs might play a catalytic role in creating such pilot projects with higher additional value that could be replicated in member countries and wider. Thank you once again for the opportunity to speak and your attention.
Thank you so much for your time, Merkulov, and thank you so much for reminding us that at the end of the day, it's also about simplifying processes for licensing, procurement, assessments, and just making it easier for all participants along the value chain. We appreciate your contribution and we look forward to engaging you a little bit further in a short while. We've got two remaining speakers for their presentations. May I just implore on you, both gentlemen, if you can stick to the allocated 8 minutes so that we can just have some engagement after all. Now, the OECD says that a 1% increase in education spending actually yields a 6% increase in economic output and productivity. So I'm raising this issue because our next speaker can help us understand some of the interesting things that are happening in Brazil by way of improving on educational investments, social impact in the area of education, but particularly utilizing the Internet of Things. We're all living in this era of the fourth industrial revolution, digitization, e-learning, e-governance. How has that helped to scale up, as it were, economic activity and contribution? So please, I yield the floor now to Professor Ronaldo Lemos from the Schwarzman College at the Tsinghua Columbia University, or Tsinghua and Columbia University. Professor Lemos, over to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lerado. It's a pleasure. Thank you to President Mark Stroiho for the invitation as well. And I'll be very short in my remarks. And actually, I have only 2 points to discuss in my presentation. So the first point that I would like to raise attention to is that every infrastructure project, including social infrastructure, has become a connected infrastructure project. So you can no longer conceive of doing any sort of form of investment in infrastructure without taking into account that you need to have connectivity, you will need to have data collection, you need to have data processing, and you're going to have to deal with a digital infrastructure. So it doesn't matter if you're investing in health, in energy, in airports, in roads, if you're doing educational investment, if you're deploying 5G networks, or if you're investing to improve governmental services or public services. In every and each of these cases, you have to consider those investments as providing connectivity and having to deal with a connectivity layer. So as a result of this particular transformation, there are significant changes in the way that we have to think about investment in those projects. So the consequence of this transition to connected infrastructure is that every project will have to consider at least 3 elements that very recently were not necessary in terms of basically the project planning. And these 3 elements are, you have to consider intellectual property, data policies, and cybersecurity. So every infrastructure project right now will have to make decisions about who gets to own intellectual property, the data that is collected through the project. You have to consider what is the policy that is applicable to that data. So who gets to have access for that data, or what is the finality, what is the purpose of that data that is being connected, and so on. And finally, you have a very important dimension of cybersecurity. As the recent colonial pipeline hack in the United States has demonstrated, even if you are running like oil pipes, you have to take into account the cybersecurity infrastructure for your project. So no longer public administrators and public officers will be able to basically disregard or ignore factors like IP, data protection, and cybersecurity. These are intrinsic elements to any infrastructure and social infrastructure projects going forward in the world of today. So this is the first point. The second point that I would like to share with you today is in regards of one missing link in terms of debating social infrastructure investments. And that is the fact that governments will have to transform themselves into digital platforms. So we are living in a moment in which every government, either by planning or by circumstances, will have to transition into digital platforms and become digital. So just like everything else, governments are also subject to this digital transformation, and that of course has profound impact over societies. So I can say that a government that does not transition into a digital platform will in various ways lose the capacity of governing. So you can no longer just opt out of this transformation. If you want to keep governance capabilities, you will have to make that transition into a digital platform. So as a result of that, one of the missing aspects of social infrastructure that I found when I read the very well prepared documents for this event is that you need to include also the question of digital identities. In a context in which governments transition into digital platforms, having a digital identity is one of the key social infrastructures that you might have. A digital identity is the login in which citizens can actually access digital services and public services in this context. So if you want to participate in healthcare, in education, and any other digital infrastructure and social infrastructure projects, you will need to have a digital identity. And of course, there is very well-established data that right now in the world, 1.1 billion people live without identification. So establishing digital identities is also absolutely important for bridging that gap and basically bringing those invisible segments of the population into the accessibility to public services and so on. So my final remark is that the new development bank is especially positioned to tackle those issues, especially because, for instance, if you look the effort that India has done in terms of creating its digital identity, Aadhaar, is actually quite remarkable. And of course, countries like Brazil, South Africa, and others can largely benefit from the cooperation with India and any other country that has advanced in regards to digital identities. And of course, you might ask, Aadhaar was designed about 8 or 10 years ago. What would be the design decisions that you do today if you had to design a digital identity? So just to conclude, I think like in the world we live today, in which we have blockchain infrastructure and other forms of distributed ledgers, it would be possible, for instance, to design a so-called self-sovereign identity, which would be not only functional, but also portable in a world that needs very much global integration. So my final point is that digital identities should be considered as a key aspect of social infrastructure. If you overlook that, the costs down the line might be really concerning, and I think that should be considered out of the start. So just to sum up, every infrastructure project is a digital project today. You need to consider IP, data protection, and also cybersecurity. And finally, you have to consider digital identities as a key part of any social infrastructure project. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Professor Lemos. Thank you for talking us through actually a broader range of issues than your summary alludes to. I mean, you speak about the government being both an arbiter of this digital ecosystem, but a player in it. That is its own complexity, and also connectivity is something that we should also have at the back of our minds. We're told that more than half of the world population right now in this digital age don't even have basic connectivity. So perhaps as we speak about investments in social infrastructure, we remember basic connectivity issues, especially in the poorer parts of the world. I thank you so much for your presentation. Our last contribution, certainly not least, is from the New Development Bank itself. The Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the NDB, Mr. Xiang Su, joins us now to share his expertise and knowledge. And sir, may I just ask of you, as you speak to us, perhaps to help us understand the intrinsic role of multilateral development banks in this space of mobilizing capital. You are pivotal to the success of more capital rollouts for social infrastructure. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's very delightful for me to join the panel on the discussions of very importantly and timely in social infrastructure, and also the integration of digital technology into the social infrastructure. Let me start with, based on my experience working long in the international financial institutions, I think that the useful role and to be played or being played by these institutions, including World Bank, Regional Bank, and now also a new one like the New Development Bank, will be at least twofold. Number one is provide financial resources to support such priority and the sectors, so that eventually these sectors can be promoted, enhanced, and then benefit largely the population of emerging market countries and also developing countries. Secondly, and through such interventions and support, that we can also make some sort of replicable cases eventually that can go largely into the practices like technology, like good practices, and also exchange of good lessons across countries. So having said that, I think that today, MDB, as my president just indicated, in addition to the economic and the fiscal infrastructure we are going to support, we also see the high values of supporting social infrastructure. We already provide a loan up to $1 billion for countries like Brazil and Russia, basic and high educations. We want to do more, we want to do better. But in terms of the different levels of educations, I think that I want to highlight the importance of one sector, that is technical and vocational education and trainings. Why? Because I think that for emerging market countries, developing countries, that kind of training education can particularly benefiting and the low income and say the poor populations. And also at the same time, if really such training education can be provided in high quality and effective, that can also try to get the support from business community, from private sector, because largely a lot of young populations living in remote and rural areas, low income groups. I'm not so sure that shortly and globally we can provide sufficient resources to let them go all to the high educations. But at the same time, in the labor market, if really some of them can be well trained through the vocational and the technical and the programs, and then eventually they can be provided to the labor market with high labor and that business communities need. That also can in turn get the support, including financial support from the business community, so that eventually we can see a sort of a win-win situation for such. But of course, today's situation is such, as everyone realizes, that the basic knowledge or even of vocational technical training and education should not be just like old-fashioned. They should also include increasingly the IT technology and the computer program, other things. So eventually, even for not so sophisticated, even including the semi and the skilled laborers, they can have access and knowledge regarding the digital technology. So eventually, they can find better opportunities in the labor markets. And the MDB will be happy and with government's support to focus on vocational technical training in our member nations, as I said, particularly to benefit the younger generation from low-income groups and also from the poor communities. Now let me turn to health. That's also important part of a social infrastructure. Probably now that globally, the focus is on health, particularly on the ongoing and the fight against COVID-19. And I think let me first refer to an interesting remark or even a warning by Bill Gates back to 2017. Basically, his message was at that time, before the COVID-19 outbreak, that according to some academic research, the annual cost of better preparedness against a pandemic annually can be at the level of $3.4 billion. At the same time, that can well prepare the humankind globally against the possible outbreak of any pandemic, and which probably can lead to a sort of annual loss of $470 billion. So that, not to mention today, over the year and a half globally, probably the economic loss and would be trillions rather than billions. So in that context, we can see and the good investment into the health sectors can generate high returns, both economically and socially. So with that in mind, I think that even though country by country, now we're still at a stage trying to protect our populations against the ongoing COVID-19. But on the other hand, it's also time to think of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 process, but also what kind of investment we should make so that next time, if unfortunately a pandemic or outbreak again, and globally and locally, and we can be better prepared. I think MDB at the moment is undertaking some analytical work and in that sense, and also with some recommendations on the priority investment by the member country, so that jointly and with MDB's possible support, we can prepare our countries, BRIC countries, but also other emerging and developing countries to be better prepared for hopefully not, but unlikely, but still possibly, and for the next pandemic and in the future. So I think that to conclude, for both education and for health, in the context of social the infrastructure, we want to be ahead of the curve, better prepare ourselves, and also focus on the benefits for the large populations, particularly the poor and the low-income groups. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Mr. Xiansu, and thank you for reminding us that actually when you look at the figures, intrinsically social infrastructure is economic infrastructure. It does catalyze other areas of innovation, development, human capital support that ultimately leads to growth. Thank you so much to all our speakers, Mr. Baldeo Purushottam from the Ministry of Finance in India, to Professor Ronaldo Lemos from the Schwarzman College in collaboration with Tsinghua and Columbia Universities, Mr. Maxim Merkulov, who represents VBE from the Russian Federation, and of course, the Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of the New Development Bank, Mr. Xiansu. In terms of my summation of what I've heard, which I think will provide food for thought in your discussions into the rest of the seminar today, we've heard that it's very important to de-risk projects, because in doing so, then you can convince the private sector to participate through public-private partnerships. When they do participate, the ease of doing business, the simplicity, clear rules of engagement, proper regulation through consultation with the business community, and transparent procurement will also enable better cooperation amongst the various players, the government itself, the private sector, and the multilateral development banks. We also heard a very important statement in itself. It's a mantra that actually every social infrastructure project is now a digital project. You can't separate the two. Digital innovation is core to unleashing social impact projects and social enterprise. And so in every approach, let us remember the digital footprint, the digital identity, and ensure that great ideas are trademarked. And this is very important, especially on the African continent, where there is so much innovation taking place, but the laws around IP and patenting can be really cumbersome and difficult. And so program developers tend to get swallowed up by the big multinationals who take on that idea and run with it. We're also seeing it with the whole issue around patents for vaccines as well the world over. And then finally, we've heard that multilateral development banks, not least the new development banks, are ready. They have the capacity, they have the research capability, they are able to underwrite a lot of the risks, and they're able to work holistically with all players in the mobilization of this capital. And so as we go forward, let's remember all of these things. As I say goodbye and hand over, let me remind you of a very special proverb that I love. here in Africa. It's a Swahili proverb which says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go with others. I know that you want to go far. So New Development Bank, we're ready to support you and your partners as you go far in bringing the much needed inputs for development and social infrastructure in the BRICS member states and the world over. I now give the floor over to Yolanda Tlorica.
Thank you very much, Lerato, for so ably moderating the high-level panel. Indeed, we want to go far. And thank you for joining us, especially today as we discuss the important aspects of social infrastructure. Thank you also to the panelists for contributing and sharing their experiences, especially from the different countries on social infrastructure. I now have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Leslie Marstorp, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the New Development Bank, who will moderate the next thematic sessions on social infrastructure. The topic of the first thematic session is integrating digital technology and social infrastructure for current times. And the second thematic session will focus on mobilizing financing for social infrastructure in the BRICS countries. I kindly request the panelists to turn on their camera and unmute themselves when they make their presentations. Mr. Marstorp, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. It's my great honor and privilege to facilitate the next round of our seminar. And in brief, I would say that the scene has very much been set in both the opening session as well as the previous one for a deep dive into the interplay between digital technology and social infrastructure. And this is a domain that Anu Madgavkar, who is our next speaker, is very much a leading world expert in. Anu is the partner of McKinsey Global Institute, as we all know, is a leading global business and economics research arm of McKinsey. And over a couple of decades, she has been sort of focused on these topics of global labor markets, growth, inequality. So Anu, I'm going to give straight over to you for your presentation. And then if we have time, we might pick up with a question or two. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and a very warm good day, good evening to all our distinguished participants. It's an absolute privilege to be part of this session, and I've been following the discussion keenly. As Leslie said, the stage has been set very well by all previous speakers. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And I would like to just share a few slides that help tee up what we see as, I think, one of the most promising opportunities, which is really the intersection of digital technology and social infrastructure, particularly in the post-COVID world, as we come out with a heightened awareness of both the challenges and the need for stronger and more resilient social infrastructure, but also a heightened awareness of the tremendous innovation, response, flexibility, and capacity that we can really build together if we come together and harness digital technology in the appropriate way. So I'd like to start with just a reminder that when digital technologies are employed to facilitate interactions between individuals and institutions, this can unlock tremendous economic value for the world. And I draw this piece from a research study that we did that actually had digital ID as the center. So the point I think that Ronaldo brought out in the previous session around digital identities of individuals form the basis on which they interact digitally to consume and produce and interact with governments and social service providers. So when you do that, and assuming high levels of adoption and the appropriate digital ecosystems around digital ID, the economic potential through time saving, cost saving, higher productivity, higher physical capital, all of these could add up to between 3 to 6% on average. Emerging economies have relatively more to gain. That spread could be up to 10 to 13% in some countries. And interestingly, a large share of that potential economic value would actually accrue to individuals. So institutions have much to gain, but individuals in turn have much to gain as well. And we all know that this is an understatement of the true value, because this does not even look at the much longer term intergenerational benefits and aspects of extending more social infrastructure to all populations. But with this context, to do this, we actually looked at a large set of digital use cases across both social and economic infrastructure, and the increasingly blurring line between the two. And these are just some examples on the page, but we looked at over 50 such digital use cases, and two things were very evident. One is that we are seeing examples of very significant scaling in certain domains, in certain countries, but very significant scale in the deployment of digital technology for social infrastructure. Whether it's, for example, in India, the Aadhaar direct benefit transfer scheme, where over 80% of public benefit disbursements are through digital ID enabled channels, whether it's through very large scale public administration transformations in Russia, in South Africa, or whether it is not just the scale that these are achieving, but also examples of the real improvement in outcomes, whether economic or otherwise. So for instance, the higher enrollment rates that birth registration technologies are bringing to bear in parts of Africa as just one example. Now, in the context of COVID, we have seen the need for social access and social services in a very heightened way. And we've also seen digital innovation permeating aspects of health and education in a very significant way. So within the health and public health domain, I think telemedicine is clearly at the forefront in terms of an example of how digital technologies are bringing those services to people. A surge of more than 400 million, I think at last count, at the end of 2020, more than 400 million telemedicine users. And a lot of this was enabled by regulations that actually permitted telehealth. But beyond telemedicine, in the domain of public health more broadly, across countries, we've actually seen through the life cycle of surveillance, testing, risk assessment, training, supply chain for critical and essential products that go into public health. Across all of these, we've seen a spate of digital innovations that potentially have improved access as well as improved the effectiveness and speed of some of these outcomes. On the education side, it's been very clear that online learning has become an experience through this phase that not everyone was familiar with in the past. But with both health and education, the surveys actually that we have done and we have seen from others would suggest that 70 to 80% or more of respondents globally, of consumers globally, do believe that online education and to some extent online or digital health will continue to be an important part of the way they interact and the way they actually avail of such services going forward. And if you add that sort of increased readiness to adopt online technologies with the already proliferating mobile technologies that are available in emerging economies around the world, what you see in education is that it's been a fantastic test bed of a range of different digital models that are engaging not just directly with students to impart the education, but to support, supplement, train, and build capacity of teachers, to consolidate large fragmented markets in the tutorial and learning augmentation space. Test prep is another very dynamic area, and then finally in vocational and professional skills as well. That whole domain is literally exploding in terms of the kinds of innovation, and much of this innovation is actually private sector led, because one common theme in emerging economies is the high desire and willingness of households to actually spend private money on education. And by providing an array of blended learning and technology-enabled learning models to augment the traditional experience, there's supply meeting demand in this particular case. But even in the classical domain of state education or publicly supported education, we are seeing much more digital technology permeating school systems, for example. So this example from Malaysia, but there are many more across a lot of countries, is basically building out digital data at a school and a micro and a student level, and then using those dashboards to really diagnose as well as then focus efforts in areas that can improve learning outcomes. And this is just one example of many such that we're also seeing. So given that technology has this, or digital technologies have this effect of making social services and social infrastructure both more efficient and more effective, an important aspect to consider is that beyond financing, what are the key enablers we really need as a system or as a set of countries to pursue this cause further. And I'd just like to highlight the importance of the 5 on the page. First of all, this is about universal coverage. You need these technology-enabled systems to cover large proportions of your population or to be whole population scale. And so widespread access to things like the foundational digital identity, but also digital infrastructure to promote access in terms of high-speed, affordable, and secure broadband, for example, is one critical piece. The second is that these are really multifaceted digital ecosystems. They cannot exist on a bilateral basis typically. They do need well-intermediated data sharing between a variety of organizations. So I use the term open data here. This could mean many things, but the fundamental principle that we should strive for is more standardization and more openness of the ability to share data in a way that's low friction. We do need then a supportive regulatory environment to emerge, because product innovation and service innovation is going to be key, even as we safeguard the interests, the data of consumers and individuals themselves. And finally, the last two, just in the spirit of the very different and specific skill sets needed as we sort of marry digital technologies with social infrastructure, there are a set of technical as well as design-related skills and market-related skills, and therefore partnerships and collaborations are key, but also cross-fertilization of learnings across developing countries. To give 2 illustrations of how some of this comes together, this is a case from India that is looking at the vision of public digital platforms. So I had talked about ways in which data can actually become accessible to multiple market participants so that data actually enables more innovation. And these are a set of public digital platforms, some of them already quite well advanced, some of them still work in process or part of the broader roadmap. But many of these have that same intent, whether it's the account aggregator ecosystem for financial data, targeting micro enterprises, or the digital health net information platform, the Diksha platform that will allow personalized learning to be accessed. But in all these cases, the idea is to have a sort of secure but also standardized and open API enabled information exchange ecosystem that innovators can tap into, but that consumers also can then benefit from in terms of the services that these enable. The second example, if you will, is really putting the spotlight on multilateral institutions and the way they are increasingly approaching this. We know that social infrastructure forms a very important part of the agenda for MDBs, and NDB is absolutely no exception to that. These are just some examples of how digital technologies are being overlaid into social infrastructure support initiatives and programs by multilateral institutions. But what I'd really like to highlight on the page is that given that this is a complex endeavor, there are some interesting and multidimensional aspects that some of these projects highlight. So one instance is how women actually can play a key role. So if you think about digital technology, social infrastructure, and overlay on that a gender lens to say, can we actually equip women to do this, to become digitally empowered and play a key role, that actually unlocks a bigger vector of value. And some financing initiatives could focus on that. The second instance is the notion of, again, coming back to digital identity, but particularly in the health sector, to think about digital health identifier or a digital health ID to be the basis for an electronic health record. So a pivotal technology that then unlocks a lot on top of that. And then finally, the behavioral aspect, which is increasingly critical, because with digital technology, you can actually implement, nudge-related strategies at scale to promote more usage of the social infrastructure that's actually being built. To close, I would just like to say that there is something for all stakeholders to do. There are actions that governments can take in terms of policies and laws that enable more innovation. There is a big role for the private sector and businesses to bring best practices, best technologies, and really the innovation with a customer-oriented lens. Civil society, of course, because there are risks and challenges associated with overlaying digital technologies into social infrastructure. And then finally, for institutions like NDB, building human resource capacity, supporting programs, but also then facilitating startups and more private investment into the space. But there is something for everyone to do and a very exciting agenda ahead. So with that, I'll close. I'm happy to take a few questions.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive overview, Anu, with some fascinating insights that you've provided. You've made a very strong case for the, if you like, revolutionary impact of digital technologies that it can have in terms of the quality of services, both in education and in health, and also on the productivity. And that productivity point was specifically important that you flagged. If I have to kind of put you on the spot and ask you, because we as a multilateral development bank and as MDBs in general, we're very much interested in scaling and in impact, right? What can be replicated and in what way can we enhance impact? What stands out for you, either if it's a regulatory intervention or any of the projects you flagged? I mean, there are many influential policymakers and people on this call. So if you had, sort of 2 minutes to sort of give us, what is that one aspect that you would want to highlight that could be replicated, either one of the projects that you highlighted in one of the slides, or regulatory intervention that can engineer that kind of impact?
I think that's a great question, because the scope is really vast. So it is helpful to kind of be focused. I think, and it also does depend a little bit on the time frame. So to answer this question, I'm going to take a somewhat medium-term frame as opposed to a very, very immediate one, because when we build infrastructure, we are really building for the next 5, 7, 10, 20 years. So we're building for the future. With that in mind, I would shine the spotlight on the notion of a sort of stack, if you will, a technology stack, but with digital identity and identification systems at the heart of it. I think India's experience with Aadhaar and then all of the Aadhaar-enabled services, largely starting with payments and financial infrastructure, but now moving into healthcare, education, and other spaces, but basically using this foundation. And I think to the point made earlier, it doesn't have to be, we are sort of technology agnostic, right? You don't have to be wedded to the architecture or the way that Aadhaar works. This could evolve as digital ID technologies and thinking evolves. It could be a federated system versus a government or a nationally mandated system. So there could be a variety of different approaches, but thinking through the architecture of what is the foundational ID layer I need, and on top of that, what are the platforms that can be enabled by more openness and standardization of data. So the open data architecture around this. And we're seeing most of that across countries and in India as well, focusing first on the financial sector. But I believe that the healthcare sector and the education sector will be the next big waves where this innovation moves.
Thank you very much for that. I know you've provoked a lot more questions, but in the interest of time, we will have to move on. I'd like now to invite Abhishek Gopalka to address what is kind of a theme that we haven't really covered much in the discussions to date. In fact, Lerato posted a very specific question around the mobilizing of financing, which is at the heart of actually implementing these very laudable ideas about enhancing social infrastructure for BRICS. For those of you who haven't looked at his bio yet, Mr. Gopalka is the senior leader in social impact and public sector practices. He's more than 11 years of experience in working with governments, foundations, international institutions, NGOs, and the private sector. So we would like now to really shine a much brighter spotlight on the mobilizing of financing. So Abhishek, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, first of all, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here today. And a big thank you and congratulations to both the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and NDB for organizing this. It's extremely topical. It is the need of the hour. And it's remarkable how you've been able to organize this in spite of all of the current challenges around the logistics. As Leslie mentioned, my presentation today really focuses on how do you mobilize social infrastructure financing, specifically in regions like ours. And I really wanted to focus on three big shifts that are needed. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the context. We've talked a lot about the fact that we are slipping behind on the SDGs across sectors, across countries. Government funding is not going to be adequate. It does need a leapfrog when it comes to private investments in social infrastructure. I loved the comment that was made earlier about the fact that there is a traditional mindset to think about healthcare and education as public goods. And that's a mindset that needs to be broken given the context of SDGs and given the context of COVID, which has further exacerbated this crisis, both in terms of health outcomes and education outcomes slipping further behind, and also governments coming under increasing fiscal pressures. So what exactly is required? I think if there was one sentence I would want to leave you with, it is a shift of mindset from projects to markets. Given the size of the problem and given how quickly we need to overcome it, if you go back to what Professor Sachs talked about as well, is that we have to think about scale and we have to move fast. And if that's the need of the hour, then there's one mindset that needs to shift, is from moving from projects to how do you catalyze markets. President Oyals talked about it to say, catalytic capital, and how do you catalyze markets to be able to achieve social goals at scale is the big question on the table. But how do you do that? I'd like to propose three big shifts in order to be able to catalyze these markets. Number one is a much sharper role for private sector. I think all of us are aware of the fact that there have been multiple experiments, and candidly speaking, and this is not just true for the BRICS, but for most countries around the world, there have been more failures than successes. And I think that calls for more focus. We need to have a much sharper articulation of where exactly should the private capital be focused within the broader social infrastructure, where the needs are the highest and private sector can serve viably when it comes to the economics. Which brings me to my second point, which is really about the sustainable economic value proposition for the private sector. I think we've, again, talked a lot about the fact that the social infrastructure projects really have a lot of challenges when it comes to economic returns. And very often what you find is that projects end up in the debt trap, especially in the initial years. So how do you move it away? You have to move it away from that by innovating on the service model to reduce cost, and to innovate on the business model, the economic model, to really make sure that outcomes start to improve. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, along with the sharper role for private sector and addressing the economics, one has to talk about scale. What's a scalable approach to make sure that these projects actually aggregate into really transforming social sectors at scale? And that's going to require institution building. It's going to require standardization, and it's going to require enhancing governmental capacity to be able to engage sustainably with private sector. So let's take a closer look into each of these three. Let's start with the role of private sector. The example on the slide is from secondary health in India, where, and this is illustrative, this is a provocative thought, where right now, if you think about the entire space, one can dimensionalize it on two dimensions. There's the classical primary, secondary, and tertiary care dimensions. And then there's where are citizens located? They're either located in your metro tier 1 cities of India, or the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities of India, which are actually booming with respect to economic activity more gradually. Then there's rural India. And now there's a fourth dimension, which is digital, because you could be anywhere. And so if those are your 3x4, 12 markets within the broader health market, where exactly do we think that the social sector investments from the private sector need to be focused? And so I'd like to say that we should first start with deprioritizing certain areas where we feel that either it's not that required or it's not viable. So let's start with primary care. Absolutely a need, but there's a question around the business model. There's not enough economic viability for private sector at scale, especially when it comes to the brick and mortar delivery system, telemedicine, etc., being an exception. On the other side, tertiary care, I think it's going to be difficult to deliver that service. Given the lack of specialists, it's probably going to be more at the metro tier 1 level for the foreseeable future. If you look at the horizontals, again, metro tier 1, you probably don't need catalytic capital. There are markets that are working there, and that will automatically attract capital, which really leaves you with two major sweet spots. I would argue, and this is again provocative, like I said, the middle spot around secondary care within tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities with feeders from the rural areas could be a very interesting place to attract private capital. And that needs to be catalyzed, that needs to be expedited. And of course, digital, all of it very attractive, low cost to serve, can absolutely be accelerated, whether it's telemedicine, EICU, and the like. So that's just one example. And without getting into a debate on whether these are the right or wrong answers, I think the broader point is around focus. So each sector, each country, let's be very sharply focused about where exactly do you get the best returns from the investments in social infrastructure. The second point is around innovation. I talked about innovation in both the service model and on the economic model. Three major shifts. Number one is moving from an input-based mindset to an outcomes-based mindset. Very often what we see in social infrastructure projects is a lot of prescriptiveness in terms of what the projects look like. You need to have a certain kind of building. There need to be a certain number of teachers. There need to be a certain number of doctors, equipment, etc. That in turn leads to a lot of regulation, and effectively it really stifles innovation. And so we need to move to a mindset where there's a lot more trusted partnerships between government and the investors, and really drive innovations by being much more outcomes oriented, whether it's learning outcomes or healthcare outcomes. That, of course, will require much, much more data-driven monitoring. The previous session, we talked about open digital ecosystems. These are the kinds of systems that will actually give you the data to be able to generate the outcomes information, which then payment models can be based on top of that. And there are examples from other countries as well where this is already happening. The second point is around innovation on the service model, where the unit cost really needs to be reduced. There are traditional advantages, again, in the countries that we're talking about within the BRICS nations around frugal, and digital, of course, fundamentally offers us the opportunity to transform things. And along with that, assets can be bundled to create feeder systems. This is true of education, best-in-class examples from Brazil, like the Nave School in Rio, and it's also true in healthcare. And then finally, on the economic model, how can one innovate on the revenue levers, such as volume guarantees, risk management levers, such as variable concession periods, because it's difficult to predict how your volumes will ramp up over time. So how can that risk be redistributed between government and private sector. And then finally, financing levers, whether it's priority sector lending and other kinds of blended finance, like what we saw in Lesotho for the hospital there. This is a slightly busy slide, but I just wanted to get a little bit more into the details of a specific example within secondary health in tier 2, tier 4 cities in India. This is not something that has been tried yet, but it's just an idea for consideration. We like to call it the public-private partnership, or a 4P model, to really improve access and quality in underserved districts in India. Just to take a step back, if you look at the secondary health landscape in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities in India, a large part of it is actually serviced by private hospitals. But what's interesting in India is that there's very high fragmentation. It's ironical that India has higher hospital density than the world, but lower bed density than the world. In other words, we have very subscale private hospitals. So the need of the hour is actually not more buildings, but larger hospitals which have lower unit cost and much higher quality. How do you achieve that? That's where we are proposing a PPP model, as I mentioned, where government can collaborate with a private player consortium, which would be a consortium of a local hospital which is present in an underserved district, in partnership with a player who brings a lot more scale and management expertise to really be able to upgrade that hospital and improve quality. What does the private player bring? The private player brings the facility, brings the local understanding, and provides administrative and clinical services. And in addition, 40% of the beds could be reserved for government insurance programs like the health scheme. What does government bring to the table? Government would provide some kind of capital to ensure financial viability, whether it's VGF or subsidies. And of course, they would be monitoring the key performance indicators, including the quality metrics. Multiple ideas in terms of how the financial viability can be improved. The concession duration needs to be much longer. We've talked about the fact that social infrastructure projects need that. Revenue levers in terms of allowing additional ancillary medical and non-medical services. Some kind of demand assurance to say, that catchment area that's being bid out to the private player is actually being offered exclusively. In other words, the financial viability gap funding would not be given to any other player in that catchment area for a certain duration. Similarly, on pricing, the reserved beds which are being reserved for the government is of course at a predetermined price, but the unreserved beds could be at a market price. On-time payments have been a challenge. How can you create escrow accounts, for example, to ensure that the payments are on time? And then finally, bundling. We've talked about how hospitals can be bundled to ensure better availability of doctors and to improve the economics. And then finally, quality incentives, making sure that the hospitals are accredited, the larger hospitals accredited, and there are financial incentives for performance on quality metrics, whether it's 30-day readmit or 30-day mortality. So that's just one idea in terms of what an innovative model could look like. And then finally, the third major shift is really around building for scale, whether it's supporting institutions such as nodal agencies and health financing intermediaries, standardized contracting and payments, such as master concessionary agreements, and then finally strengthening government capacity to engage private sector, where you would need PPP cells and private engagement cells at the state level, at the district level, to be able to manage these relationships on an ongoing basis. Which brings me to my last slide. I think realizing and ushering this new paradigm of social infrastructure financing is going to require concerted efforts from multiple stakeholders. If we think about governments, it's going to require an identification of the priority areas within healthcare and education. It's going to require a shift to outcomes-based models and outcome monitoring systems. And it's going to require rebalancing risk to make these projects much more viable. And whether it's MDBs, investors, or entrepreneurs, again, similar set of actions required. How do you continuously innovate on the service model to reduce unit cost? How do you innovate on the business model to improve the financial viability? And how do you support government with institution building, whether it's financial intermediaries or private sector engagement cells? I truly believe it's possible, and I do think it's the need of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. Now, as you know, as you've outlined in your presentation, there has been consensus for a good number of years now about the need for this mindset shift and for the private sector to play a much bigger role in terms of mobilizing capital for infrastructure and specifically social infrastructure. However, it has not happened at scale, and this consensus existed since, I would say, probably 2015 with the Addis Financing for Developer conference. Now, you've outlined a number of ideas: scaling blended finance. You've spoken about the need for change in mindsets, changing from projects towards catalyzing markets, and so on. All of those are essential. But again, like as I've done with Anu, if I could put you on the spot, can you tell me what do you think is that one intervention that can achieve the mobilization of private capital at scale?
Leslie, that's a great question. And I would go back to the first point that I made. I think there would have to be a thought process around how do you catalyze markets, right? So it's not about, identifying that one project which would succeed. I think for every MDB to really say, which is the priority area where we believe there can be a fundamental transformation at scale, that requires a very different thought process. Because instead of, investing in a project, you might choose to invest in a financing intermediary, because that's not one project, that's hundreds of projects, thousands of projects. That's the need of the hour. One would think about developing digital ecosystems, like what was being mentioned in the previous session as well, and how do you fund that digital infrastructure? So I think it's a very interesting comment that was made in the previous session as well, right? I mean, going fast versus going far is going to require creation of markets. So whether it's the investments in institutions, capacity building, that's going to be essential.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. There would have been several other themes I would have loved to explore. In conclusion, I mean, as we know, both in all three sessions, actually, there's been so many new ideas that have been presented here, and hopefully we'll be able to take this forward in some manner in the new development bank as we construct our future thought leadership engagements. Hopefully we can also engage with some of the speakers here at a future time. I would love to hand over the session now back to the moderator, to Yolanda, to hand over for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for moderating the thematic session, and a very special thank you to our speakers for their thought-provoking interventions. In closing, I would like to invite Mr. Vladimir Kasbekov, the Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer of the New Development Bank, for some closing remarks. Mr. Kasbekov, please provide your closing address.
Good evening, distinguished colleagues and speakers. And I would frankly say that it's a rather hard task to summarize the results of this meeting, because a lot of very important matters discussed, but definitely for me it's clear we need to have another sessions to discuss these matters of social infrastructure financing investment. And today's discussion clearly reiterated crucial role of social infrastructure, both in the economic development of a nation and development of quality of life of our societies. Economy becomes more and more knowledge and technology intensive investment. Creation and accumulation of human capital should become a priority both for public and private stakeholders. In other words, human capital is fast becoming one of the key factors of production that would drive the future economic growth and determine the quality and robustness of economic development. Today some interesting data were presented by speakers, including data on the influence of increase of investment in the university and education to the increase of economic output. It's like in OECD countries, 1% increase in investment in that education associated with nearly 6% increase of economic output. BRICS country and our shareholders, as for the moment, cannot pay the same, invest the same amount of money as OECD countries in this social infrastructure. And definitely one of the key mandate for NDB to support our member countries and substitute their activity and support the development of social infrastructure, including digital and more sophisticated aspects of the social infrastructure development. That's why NDB considering different options, and it's today we got very valuable inputs, examples and stories, investment stories coming from India on PPP project, from Russia, very interesting presentation by Indian speaker. So I think that NDB as well as other MDBs must try its best to find good niche to invest, to attract private investment into social infrastructure financing. As for we believe that as a result of the huge investment by NDB to support our member countries' efforts to fight coronavirus, and as soon as a resumption of economic growth, total amount of money to be disbursed like $10 billion US. So we hope that later we can, like my colleague San just mentioned, later we can get good analysis of the effectiveness of those investments by member countries. At the same time, we're going to use this analysis to cooperate closely with other MDBs and with the private institution and national development banks to mobilize resources for the bankable project. This is the niche for NDB to find good financial solution for the projects in that both in educational and healthcare sectors of social infrastructure. In the end, let me once again reiterate our gratitude to the participants of today's events, especially Secretary Seth and Professor Sachs. Hope to see you in the near future. And I think that that could be a very interesting opportunity for NDB to develop its knowledge in different aspects of social infrastructure investment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kazbekov, for your closing address. What's left for me is just to say thank you to all of you, especially our distinguished speakers, for taking the time to participate in today's seminar and to reflect on the different approaches of social infrastructure and, more importantly, NDBs and other NDBs' role therein. I think that the panelists have given very insightful remarks, and I'm certain that all participants agree that we have learned a great deal today and we are more enriched by the discussion. I want to in particular thank the Government of India and all the Ministry of Finance officials for their great collaboration, and also a special thank you to Mr. Kishora and all the NDB colleagues who have contributed to the preparation of this seminar. So thank you to everyone.